Good evening. My name is Pat Schenkel, and I'm honored tonight to introduce our guest speaker, Ron Hall. Together, Ron Hall and Denver Moore penned a story that Deborah Hall began as she worked with the homeless at the Union Gospel Mission in Fort Worth. After losing his wife Deborah to cancer in 2000, Ron vowed to continue her work. They have traveled to 250 cities and raised over $70 million. Now, for a homeless man and an upscale art dealer, that's quite a feat. For the bond that formed between these people certainly rings a bell, strikes a chord with our Arms of Hope mission. In May of this year, Ron began the next chapter of his life when he married Beth Walker, a former Dallas Christian graduate. They're making home here in Dallas. Please join me as I welcome Ron Hall.
I love that lady. I've known her for many, many years, for Pat and Pete, and they knew me back when I was not a homeless advocate, and if I hadn't straightened up my ways, I could have become homeless as well. But my co-author, Denver Moore. Hey, Denver, please stand up and let them know you made it tonight. Denver Moore. This guy has had a lot of health problems in the last year or so and has not been able to make any out-of-town engagements. We did one in Nashville recently, but mostly just pray for Denver's health, that he continues to improve, and I'm so happy to have him tonight. So he always tells me, he said, you go out there and open them up and let me shut them down. So he's going to shut you down tonight, and you know when it's over, so I'm telling you. But he told me to remind you, whenever I go anywhere, we have to put out a disclaimer that, first of all, though our lips will always be flapping like Bible leaves, we ain't no preachers. I'm just an old art dealer and he's an old ex-con. We're two sinners and we've been saved by grace with a message of hope. There were a couple of businessmen that were driving by a homeless family that they saw living in cardboard boxes under the bridge. And one of the men looked at his friend and he said, I'd really like to ask God why he allows all this poverty in our city. And he said, I think that's a fair question, so why don't you ask him? He said, because I'm scared. He said, what are you scared of? He said, well, I'm really afraid that God will ask me the same question. Well, as a matter of fact, God does ask us that question. And if you've read your Bible, which I'm sure everybody in here has, you just go back to Luke chapter 10, the story of the Good Samaritan. And how many, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but how many in here have judged that poor priest and Levite for leaving that man in the ditch? I'm telling you, I used to wear those guys out thinking they were the two sorriest guys in the world. And then I started studying the passage, and one day I got to realizing that what could they have possibly been thinking as they walked by and left that man in the ditch? And so I started analyzing it, and I realized that they had to look at the man and think, well, what is going to happen to me if I stop and help that guy? I don't have time to get involved in this. And the good news is, along came the Samaritan, and he asked a whole different question. He saw the man in the ditch, and instead of asking what's going to happen to me if I stop and help, he thought and asked himself the question, well, what is going to happen to him if I don't? I can tell you that Mother Teresa once said that it's very fashionable now to talk about the poor and the homeless. Everybody's talking about them, but unfortunately, it has never become fashionable to sit down and talk with them. When I first met Denver 13 years ago now, we've been on a long adventure together. But 13 years ago, we were walking the streets of Fort Worth, and one day he said, I know it ain't none of my business, but you mind if I ask you a question? And he said, this is a question that puzzles a lot of homeless people on the street. And I said, well, Denver, of course you can ask me a question. You can ask me anything you want. He said, okay. He said, are you a Christian? I said, oh, yeah, as a matter of fact, I am. Yeah, why do you think I'm down here walking the streets, passing out $1 here and $1 there like I was really doing something good for somebody? You know, I thought I was helping the homeless. I was actually just passing out a few blessings for the day, making me feel better about myself and who I was down there doing something that really didn't cost me anything or any time. But anyway, I said, of course I'm a Christian. Why do you think I'm doing this down here with you? And he said, well, then maybe you can answer me this question. I said, well, what is it you want to know? He said, why is it, as he pointed his finger right at me, he says, why is it that all you Christians worship one homeless man on Sunday, then turn your back on the first one you see on Monday? I said, wow, Denver, I'm going to think about that. He said, Mr. Ron, you never know whose eyes God is watching you through, and it ain't going to be your preacher or your Sunday school teacher. It may just be that man on the street corner, or maybe the man in the ditch. He said, but again, pointing his finger, he says, sometimes you successful folks, we all can rise up way too high and you totally miss God. He said, but you can never stoop too low to help somebody and have God miss you. I can tell you the wisdom from this self-proclaimed old fool who never went to school, we need a lot more of that kind of wisdom around. But God had a different plan. Thank you. God really had a plan for Denver. He spared his life so many times. This guy's been shot and stabbed more than probably anybody in the whole world is still living to tell about it. But anyway, but God had a plan, and now he has become somewhat of a rock star. This guy, I'm telling you, when we walk around the country, everybody knows Denver Moore now. And just about 3.5 years ago, we were invited to a very special day at the White House, and probably one of the finest moments of my life was being in the private living quarters of the President and First Lady, and in the President's office there on the 3rd floor of the White House, and seeing the President of the United States walk in and extend his hand and say, Denver Moore, what an honor to meet you, sir. Thank you for what you're doing. And I thought, wow, this is unbelievable. The President of the United States knows what was formerly the most dangerous and the longtime homeless man of Fort Worth, Texas. This was incredible. But we spent a special day there and had lunch with him, and it was a wonderful, wonderful day. Then we spoke that night at the Symphony Center in Washington. And as we left that afternoon in the White House, we'd gone through the Marine Honor Guard, and we'd gone through all kinds of, protocol. It was just a wonderful day. And we get in the limousine and we're pulling out of the White House, and he starts laughing uncontrollably. And I said, what is so dang funny? He said, Mr. Ron, I done gone from living in the bushes to eating with the bushes. He said, God bless America. This is a great country. But then he got a real serious look on my face, and he said, but you and I know the truth, that we are just a couple of nobodies. But the truth is, we were loved by a real somebody. And that somebody, the star of our show, of course, other than our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the star of our show would be Deborah Hall. Miss Debbie, Denver called her. She was my wife of 30 years. And I'll tell you, she was a true good Samaritan. She was a champion for the homeless. And I'll tell you, this is her story, and we never want to forget, never forget, that apart from her faithfulness to God and her forgiveness to me, something that I totally did not deserve, but apart from that, we would not have a story to tell. And of course, this Denver story, a man who was in a ditch, in need of a good Samaritan, and he can testify. Actually, this is the name of our new book. He can testify, what difference do it make when someone shows you the love of Christ and not just flips you a coin or gives you a sandwich and a dollar bill and tells you that Jesus loves you. While I was privileged to witness both of their lives, if you've read the book, then you know my story and that I am merely their storyteller. Right after Debbie died, Denver moved on to the property with me. He lived with me for nearly 9 years, now has his own place. But he lived with me for nearly 9 years. But when we first moved in, He told me, he said, Mr. Ron, there ain't nobody ever going to believe our story. He said, we got to write us a book. And I said, well, what's this we, Kimosabe? I didn't think you knew how to read or write, so who is going to write this book? And he said, oh, you know what I mean. He said, I'm going to tell you my part of the story, and you write that down. And you know your part of the story, and so you write that down. And then when we're all finished, we'll put those two of them together, and that'll be a book. And I said, all right, Denver, so we'll do that. So for the next 3.5 years, we sat at the breakfast table, and we wrote us a book. And when we finally got the book ready, I can tell you, we got turned down more than the sheets in a 5-star hotel. We could not get anybody to read our book or even publish it, or an agent. We could do nothing. But by the grace of God, Thomas Nelson finally decided that they would publish our book as a favor, just so I would quit knocking on their door. But, you know, Thomas Nelson is the largest Christian publisher in the world, but they didn't have any money for promoting or advertising first-time authors telling these unbelievable stories, so they didn't budget any money. But they did have a plan that was going to cost them nothing, and that plan, they were going to send one copy to Chicago in care of Oprah Winfrey, and she was going to read our book, and then it was going to be lights out. We would be instant celebrities and instant Oprah Book Club. I mean, we were going to be the new darlings of the book world. And so, and then, of course, if we were on Oprah, we were going to be on the Good Morning talk shows and the ABCs and NBCs and all those shows. And that was just the natural progression. But, you know, that didn't happen. And, in fact, it still didn't happen. And in fact, last year, when Oprah went off of the air and we still hadn't heard from her, we dedicated an old country song to her that Randy Travis used to sing, and the words go a little bit like this. Since our phone still ain't ringing, I'm assuming it still ain't you. So that's for Oprah. But Zig Ziglar told a story a few years ago, and I heard it, I've never forgotten this story, about when he was a young boy that they had a lady that cooked biscuits for them every morning, and they used to be about 1.5 inches, 2 inches thick. They were the most beautiful biscuits in the world. But one morning they were served on a platter, and it looked like sand dollars laying on the beach, you know, and he said, what happened to the biscuits this morning? And she said, well, to tell you the truth, they squatted to rise, but they just got cooked in the squat. So that's what happened to our book. We were going to be on Oprah. We were going to be on ABCs and NBCs and all that kind of stuff. But we got cooked in the squat before we got on anything. And so anyway, we were left to our own devices to promote our book. And we had piles of them in our living room, and we had given them out and sold them to all of our friends. And we finally ran out of friends, and we didn't have any more friends to sell them to. So we were just left with piles of books. And so a friend of ours said, well, you ought to try to get in the Texas Book Festival. You know that Debbie, my late wife's best friend, is chairman of the board of that festival, and your son-in-law's first cousin is president of the festival. And I said, well, wow, then we'll introduce our book there. So we sent them some copies of the book and told them we'd be happy to be a part of their book festival. And we made reservations to go to Austin. And a few days later, we get a letter back from them. It says, you have been rejected. And I thought, wow, this is our family. This is my daughter's namesake, my wife's best friend, and they're telling us that we're rejected. And they said there's no place in a book festival for a book like yours. And as I was reading that to Denver, I was about to cry. And I said, Denver, what are we going to do? And he said, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to stop right now, and we're going to bless all those folks that turned us down. He said, because Mr. Ron, we didn't write this book for Oprah Winfrey. We didn't write this book for the Texas Book Festival or for any ABs or CBs or all those other letters of the alphabet you've been talking about where we're supposed to be. He said, we wrote this book for Miss Debbie, and most of all, we wrote this book for God. He said, so don't you never ask nobody to do nothing for this book as long as you and I both live, and you and I are going to be just fine. We're going to give it to God. He'll take care of his business. We'll be okay. I said, okay. So we stopped and we prayed and we gave the book over to God. And we didn't hear from God for a long time. He went quiet on us. He said, God, we got piles of books around here, God. What are we going to be doing? And then lo and behold, out of nowhere, we get a call from Boston. we couldn't get on anything here in Dallas or Fort Worth. But from Boston, Massachusetts, we got a call. Somebody there had read our book and wanted to be on us to be on a morning talk show live in Boston at 7 o'clock in the morning, but they said we could do it live from Dallas in a TV studio. So we went to a TV studio. They told us what to wear, what color shirt to wear, which cameras to look at, and who would be talking to us, and what the questions were. And the first question they threw out that morning, live from Boston, was to Denver Moore. And they said, we have 2 authors this morning, friends that have written a book on friendship and on hope and redemption and all these things. Let's go to Denver Moore. Denver, can you tell us a little bit about your book? I mean, Denver was like worse than a deer in the headlights. I mean, this was like a cat on LBJ in front of an 18-wheeler. He's like, he didn't know what to do. And so I was about to jump in and answer the question. He said, hold it just a minute now. I'm going to tell you all the truth. Now, I don't read and I don't write. So I didn't write that book and I ain't even read it. Now, what's your next question? And I thought, God help us if we ever get invited to do anything again. But I can tell you that it must be God's book, because just as of last week, we fell off the New York Times best-selling list after 3.5 years on the New York Times best-selling list, and now more than 1,400,000 books have been sold. So I praise God for that. It is His book. And it's like, and I can tell you, we have, just like Pat Schenkel said, we've been in more than 250 cities. We've told our story now more than 650 or 700 times on radios and television and banquet halls like this. And but when our book first came out, one of the curious things that happened is that, of course, when Denver and I are together, people recognize us. I can go incognito and nobody ever knows who I am, but as soon as I show up with Denver, in fact, I have to tell you a funny story. I get answer the phone the other day, and it's Denver, and he said, there's somebody here wants to talk to you. And I said, okay. So he hands the phone to him, and this guy says, this is Officer so-and-so with the Dallas Police Department. And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I pulled over Mr. Moore for a traffic violation, and I see that he's got an unpaid ticket and a warrant for his arrest. But he said, I'm just going to go take care of that for him. He said, I'm his biggest fan. I can't believe I'm talking to the man, pulled over the man that wrote Same Kind of Different as Me, my all-time favorite book. And he said, so I'm going to help him out instead of taking him where I should be taking him. And I thought, so anyway, I thought, this is so good that, I mean, Denver, but all the people at first, they were coming up to us and wanting us to come to their Bible studies. And everybody was asking us to go to Bible studies. So it was Bible study this and Bible study that. And we had been invited to go to maybe 30 or 40 Bible studies. And all of a sudden, Denver looks at me one day after this lady would not leave us alone. And he looked at me and he said, I got to ask you a question. I said, what is it? He said, do all white folk got Bible studies? I said, wow, it sure seems like it, doesn't it, Denver? He said, yeah, but you know, what's even more curious to me is that of all these white ladies that invited us to their Bible studies, nary a one of them have ever invited us to a Bible doing. Now, he said, are they just studying, or is anybody out there doing? Because I ain't never been to no studies for nothing. I don't know anything about studying, but I know something about doing. So if they want to invite me to do them, tell them I'll show up, but I ain't going to no studies. So... But that's what I love about Arms of Hope. Arms of Hope is nothing but straight away Bible doing, showing the love of Christ to people that need it in the worst kind of way. I can tell you that as we were going to one of our first events a few years ago, we were driving, and by coincidence, we heard this song by Norah Jones. But it's not actually by coincidence, because a friend of mine told me after I told him that a coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. And so God was remaining anonymous as we were heading off to this speaking event, and the song came on the radio, and the words went a little bit like this. The work and prayers of a century have brought us to this day. What will be your legacy? What will your children say? Well, let them say of me that I was one who believed in sharing the blessings that I received. And let me know in my heart that when my days are through, America, America, I gave my best to you. And we believe, Denver and I both believe, that God has given us a calling on our lives to travel across America, asking people to give their best to their cities, to give their best to organizations like Arms of Hope. And that's what we came here tonight, is to ask you to give your very best. You know, you've got plenty and then some. Let's help these others go out and get plenty and then some too. Denver, we just wrote a children's book, and on the last page of the children's book, I said, what do you want to tell the kids on the last page? And he said, tell them that nobody can help everybody, but everybody can help somebody. Thank you. And for those of you that have not read Same Kind of Different as Me, or What Difference Do It Make? Same Kind of Different as Me is really a story about how Fort Worth, Texas, and now many cities across America, in fact, we've heard from more than 60 foreign countries. Our book is now in 14 different languages. But we've heard how many cities were changed and how Fort Worth, Texas was changed when a godly woman decided to go into the inner city of Fort Worth and share the blessings that she had received and do some Bible doings. When she saw the people in the ditches, unlike the priest and the Levites, she would never ask, what's going to happen to me if I stop and help? But she would ask, what's going to happen to them if I don't? She vowed that she would never worship one homeless man on Sunday and turn her back on the first one she saw on Monday. She also vowed that she was going to love the ugly ones, and she was going to love the smelly ones, and she was going to love the crazy ones, and even the dangerous ones. And she refused to call them homeless people, vagrants, street people. All of those words she took out of her vocabulary and she replaced them with only two words, and those two words were God's people. And our story is a love story about how Debbie's love and her Christ-like forgiveness gave new life to two men who had found themselves in a ditch. One being Denver, after 10 years at Angola State Penitentiary, the hellhole of America, 25 years on the streets of Fort Worth. When he used to wake up in the morning and saw his toes would still wiggle and he knew he was alive, he would sometimes curse, thinking, I have to endure another day on earth, when he really just wanted to be in heaven. You know, he lived one of the most tragic lives that I've ever known. And he had no purpose in life and no reason to really want to live. And me, I'm the other guy that was in a ditch, that after I had dishonored my wife after 18 years of marriage, she threw my sin as far as the east is from the west, never to bring it up again. And I vowed that I would love her like she had never been loved before. And those of you that have read our book know that Denver's story began on a plantation in Louisiana. Very tragic beginning to his life, and there's something that happened so tragic in his life we don't speak about it from the podiums, and if you want to know what happened, you'll have to read the book. But those of you that read the book know exactly what I'm talking about. And that day on a dirt road in Red River Parish, Louisiana, he made a vow that never again, and he meant that, never again in his life would he speak to a white woman. And never again in his life would he trust a white person. And for my part of the story and Debbie's part of the story, really began about 1998. We'd been in Dallas 13 years, and I wanted to be a cowboy and a rancher. We wanted to move back to Fort Worth to be closer to our ranch at Rocky Top in Palapena County. And Debbie and I had both been serving and living purpose-driven lives, and I'm sure probably most of you in here have read that book. It's one of the best-selling books in history other than the Bible. So you know what I'm talking about when you're talking about living a purpose-driven life. You know, Debbie's purpose in life was serving the Almighty God and serving those that needed to know the love of Christ. And my purpose in life had been serving the almighty dollar. The last thing on my mind was ever serving at a homeless mission. But God had a different plan, and it was about to reset my compass and rewrite my life story. Debbie and I were building a new contemporary dream home in Fort Worth, Texas. And in this contemporary dream home, she began to dream. And the first night she dreamed there was going to be the most beautiful mission in all of America would be built for God's people in Fort Worth, Texas. And the people there would be treated with respect and dignity like they're treated at Bold. They would be given accommodations where there'd be new furniture and not the things we put out on our curb and let the Salvation Army pick up. They would be given new clothes and not the hand-me-downs that we try to give away that don't fit us anymore, that once they get tattered and worn. But anyway, that was also, that would have beautiful flowers like our spring pastures at Rocky Top. And it was a very, very real dream to her, and she shared that dream with me. And then the next night she dreamed that there was a homeless man on the streets of Fort Worth. And she said, Ron, it was just like this verse in Ecclesiastes 9:15 that said, there was found in the city a certain poor man who was wise, and by his wisdom he saved the city. She said, this man is foolish, but he's wise. And she said, I believe if we can find him, if my dream is real and we can find this man, then I believe we will see revival in our city. So that day, I went with her and we began serving the noon evening meal at the Union Gospel Mission in Fort Worth, Texas. And things went pretty well for the first couple of weeks after I got over my initial affront to the smells and the way the people looked. And, you know, I'd spent most of my life in museums and art galleries and very fancy people like all of you sitting here tonight. But once I got over that, you know, I started enjoying it. And then after a couple of weeks, we're sitting in the dining hall waiting to serve, and we're behind the stainless steel serving counter and waiting for about 300 or 400 men to come out of the chapel. And all of a sudden, as they start exiting the chapel, a huge fight breaks out. It was pandemonium in the dining hall. And it was not just a pushing match and a few curse words. This was screaming profanities, bodies being tossed around, tables overturned, blood and spilled out on the floor, and it was moving our way. And I've never been so scared in my life. I took a knockout punch in the Golden Gloves in high school, and I swore I would duck any punch that ever came my way again. And the only way I could see that I was going to stay out of this fight is if I found me a hiding place under the stainless steel serving counter. And so then I kind of found a little cubby hole down there, and I started trying to crawl in it. And I could still hear all the pandemonium and screaming, but I kind of was wondering what happened to Debbie. And I look around, and she's over there standing like a cheerleader on the sidelines of a football team, and she's jumping up and down. She's saying, that's him, that's him. And I look up and say, that's who? And when I looked out, there was only one man left standing in the fight. And he looked like a giant of a man. And he had hands the size of boxing gloves, and he had on no shirt and no shoes and just some raggedy old unzipped breeches. And he was screaming at the top of his lungs, I'm going to kill whoever done it. I'm going to kill whoever stole my shoes. And she looked down at me in my hiding place and she said, the man threatening to kill everybody is the one I had the dream about. And she said, and I believe that I heard from God that you have to be his friend and find out if my dream is real. And I looked up and I said, but Debbie, I was not at that meeting you had with God. And if I'm going to be friends with someone who wants to kill everybody, then I think that maybe I should go talk to God myself. Well, I asked the guy that was one of God's people that was standing in the line next to me, I said, who is that crazy man? And he said, I don't even know his name. He said, it may be Dallas. I'm sorry, that's just what he said. It may be Dallas. But he said, let me tell you, some people call him suicide because he ain't afraid to die. And some people just call him the lion of the jungle because he rules the streets with fear and intimidation. He said, I would stay as far away from that man as you can because he will hurt you. And I said, thank you very much. And as opposed to what my wife is telling me, I plan on taking your advice. But at Debbie's insistence, every morning, she would say, would you please drive through the inner city before you go to the ranch and just see if you can see him. And so I'd make the drive through the inner city, and I'd usually see him by a dumpster. I would usually see him, you know, standing somewhere near the bushes of the railroad tracks. But as soon as he would see my green pickup, he'd take off in the bushes, and I could report, oh, I did see him, but whew, I was thank God that I didn't get him in the car. But anyway, I didn't tell her that, but I tried. But anyway, it was just a few weeks later. We had actually not met him, and we had not served him yet. But as we were shutting down the serving line a few weeks later, he comes through the line by himself. We were about to shut it down. And he puts 2 plates in front of us, and he doesn't make any eye contact, and his head is down, and he just shoves 2 plates up. Well, Debbie had made a vow that she was going to learn the name of every homeless person on the streets of Fort Worth, ask them what their specific needs were, and then pray every day for them and try to match up their needs with someone who could meet those needs for them. So she just bent over and tried to make eye contact, and so she said, "Well, hello there. My name is Debbie. What is your name?" And I can tell you, if looks could kill, she would have been dead on the spot, because he said, "Ma'am, I am a very bad man. You don't know who you're messing with. You just shut up and give me some food, and I'm going to get on out of here." Wow, I was so scared, because he was screaming about 2 feet from my face. And so all of a sudden, the next thing I know, Debbie leaps over the stainless steel serving line. She is standing face to face with him, and she butts up next to him like this, starts tapping him on the nose and saying, "You are not a bad man at all. You, in fact, are a good man, that God has a calling on your life, and you're going to live to see it." I'm telling you, his fists started doubled up, and he stood there, and he was shaking like this. My fists were doubled up, and I was shaking like this. And I looked down at my fists, and I'm thinking, I don't know why my fists are doubled up. If he hits her, I'm running out the door. She got herself in this mess. I'm not going to fight somebody who wants to kill everybody. But fortunately, he just dropped his hands by his side, left. The hush fell over the dining room. And the guy, one of God's people standing next to me, he said, my, I never thought I'd see some skinny little lady tame the lion of the jungle." At Debbie's insistence, for the next 5 months, every day I drove through the inner city, trying to get him in my car to find out if her dream was real. And finally, one morning, I get him in the car, and we go to the Cactus Flower Cafe, and I find out a lot about him that morning. He had never been to school a day in his life. He had been raised on a plantation. He had been homeless for more than 30 years. He had slept on the sidewalk in downtown Fort Worth, right outside my art gallery, where I kept millions of dollars worth of paintings. He slept at the entrance to the garage where I parked my new Mercedes. I used to call the police and ask them to remove the trash from the streets, meaning the homeless people that were hitting me up and staying out in front of my gallery. Not once in all the years that he stayed there did I offer him a penny or a cup of water, just like the priest and the Levite. So anyway, at the end of that message, that breakfast, he looked at me and he said, "What is it you want from me?" He said, "I've had no peace in my life since your skinny little wife showed up on the streets." And I said, "Hey, I just want to be your friend." And he looked at me and he said, "You want to be my friend?" I said, "That's it, straight up, man. I just want to be your friend." He started shaking his head. He said, "Wow, man, I'm going to think about that." And I thought to myself, hey, buddy, you just looked a gift horse in the mouth. You don't know who I am and what I can do for you, you know. If you want some nice car, I can get you a car. If you want nice clothes, I can get you clothes. If Debbie tells me to do something, I'm going to do it for you. So, you know, don't be dissing me like I'm just, you're going to have to think about being my friend. I'll tell you, I'm so arrogant. And was so arrogant at that time that I couldn't imagine that this man had anything, zero, to offer me in a friendship. That I would be his great benefactor. And if he cleaned himself up and hung around me, I would make him feel bad that he didn't make all the choices that I'd made in life to be just like me. That's what I thought. That's the arrogant person that I was. I didn't celebrate him for who God made him to be. A couple of weeks later, I saw him taking trash out of a dumpster, feeding the birds and all the wild animals on the streets down in the inner city. And I pulled up and I said, hey, you want to go get some coffee? And he said, yeah, I guess so. So he gets in the car and we head off to Starbucks. And on the way, he starts beating on the dash of my pickup, screaming at me, I want you and your wife to leave me alone. Man, I have no peace. And he was screaming at me. And I was thinking, if I get you out of the car today and I'm still alive, I'm going to leave you alone because you scare me and I think you might kill me. I had been pursuing him for 5 months at that time, and I'd had it with him. But we're sitting at Starbucks, and he said, "What's your name?" I said, "My name is Ron." He said, "No, your name is Mr. Ron." I said, "No, it's not." He said, "Your name is Mr. Ron, or your name ain't nothing." I said, "My name is Mr. Ron. What else you want to talk about?" He said, "Mr. Ron, I've been thinking a lot about what you asked me." I said, "Well, what did I ask you that required any thought?" He said, "Well, you asked me if I'd be your friend." I said, "I sure did, so what do you think about it?" He said, "Well, there's something I heard about white folks that really bothers me, and it's got to do with fishing." I said, "Well, Denver, I'm not a fisherman. I don't know anything about it. I'm a cowboy, a rancher, an art dealer. I know a little bit about those things, but I don't know anything about fishing. I don't even own a tackle box." He said, "Well, I bet you can answer my question." I said, "Okay, so what is it?" He said, "Well, I heard that when white folks go fishing, they do this thing they call catch and release." I said, "Denver, of course they do. It's a sport. Don't you get it?" He said, "No, sir, I don't get it at all." He said, "Because back on the plantation, we'd go out in the morning and cut us a cane pole, dig us some worms, sit on the river bank, and when we got something on our line, we were really proud of what we caught, and we'd show it off to our friends, and we would use it for life, to live." He said, "So it just occurred to me, if you're a white man that's fishing for a friend, and you're going to catch and release, then I ain't got no desire to be your friend." And my mind flashed back to Debbie's dream, this poor man who was wise, because what he spoke to me at that moment was the wisest thing I had ever heard in my life having to do with friendship. And I can tell you that we all have defining moments and decisions that we make in our lives that reshape our character and dictate how our life story would read. And I was facing mine at that moment. Would I accept the offer to be his friend and not catch and release from someone that I actually thought was going to kill me? Someone that I had witnessed threatened to kill everybody in a room? Someone that was so different from me? Would I do that? And would I be honest with him and saying, "The only reason that I'm pursuing you is because I cheated on my wife and I told her I would do anything she asked me the rest of my life, and it has to do right now with being your friend"? So, would I be honest with him? All I could think at that moment, if I ever heard from God in my life, it was be his friend. So I said, "Okay, Denver, I'm going to make you a deal. If you'll be my friend, I will not catch and release." And the fear that I had for this man melted right there on the sidewalk at Starbucks. And he stood up and he gave me a hug and he said, "Mr. Ron, you got a friend for life." And I said, "Denver, you do too." And he became a part of our family. We invited him to everything we did at our family. Every meal, every church service we went to, weddings. He had a little problem going into the country club, but he told me one day, he said, "Hey, Mr. Ron, I got your back covered, but you need to be covering mine." He said, "When you walk in the streets down here with all the homeboys that, looking after you, trying to maybe do something bad to you," he said, "I got your back covered." He said, "But when you take me out to that country club, you better be covering mine." I said, "Okay." But a few months later, into a marvelous friendship, he told me one day, he had a very sad look on his face. He said, "Mr. Ron, what Miss Debbie is doing for the homeless on the streets of Fort Worth, she has become precious to God." He said, "When you become precious to God, you become important to Satan." He said, "Watch your backside. The thief comes in the night and something bad's getting ready to happen to Miss Debbie." Just about 3 or 4 days later, she was diagnosed with cancer. A cancer that was so aggressive, some doctors thought she would only live 3 months. But the good news is she lived 19 months. But I realized after she had her surgery that I hadn't seen Denver in 4 or 5 days, so I went down to the mission to find him. And I walked in to the mission. I saw Chef Jim, and I said, "Have you seen Denver?" And he said, "Well, he's probably over there asleep in one of those old warehouses on a big bundle of clothes that's over there. I see him over there sometimes." And I looked at my watch, and it was after lunch. And I thought, sleeping at noon, what a lazy, lazy man. And Chef Jim saw that arrogance on my face. He saw that snap judgment, and he said, "Ron, you don't have a clue what's going on here, do you?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't." He said, "Well, when Denver heard that Miss Debbie was sick, he came to me and he said, I've been on this cook here at the mission for a long time, and Denver's never spoken to me. He said, but he came to me and he said he knew she had a lot of friends that would be praying for her all day, but he believed he had heard from God that he was to be the one to pray for her all night. So he said he goes out at sundown and at night and he lays by the dumpster there and he prays for you and your family all night long until the sun comes up. And then he comes in and he and I pray with y'all, for y'all together. I tell you, I've never felt so low in my life that I had judged him as a lazy man who had nothing to offer me in my arrogance. Yet, this man was giving me the greatest gift I'd ever received in my life of at least 8 to 10 hours a night in continuous prayer for my wife and for me and my children. I couldn't even go over and thank him. I was so ashamed that my son, Carson, saw how arrogant and sorry I am. But for 19 months, he did that. And he began to bring us marvelous messages that he heard from God in the night. And even though that we had some of the wealthiest friends and most influential Christian friends in America, it's amazing how God chose the most dangerous, homeless, poorest man on the streets of Fort Worth to comfort us most in our greatest time of need. And on the last day of our life, he came to tell us that that was what it was going to be. He had told us many things. He was never wrong. But he told us many things, and on that day he said he needed a private meeting with Miss Debbie. So he went in her room and he kneeled beside her bed, and he said, Miss Debbie, I know the only reason you've been hanging on this long is because you don't know who's going to take care of God's people when you're gone. He said, but I was praying last night and God told me, go tell Miss Debbie to lay down her torch. And Denver, you pick it up. He says, that's what I'm here to tell you, Miss Debbie. You can lay it down, and I'm going to pick it up, and I'm going to carry it for you the rest of my life. And the man who swore that he would never again speak to a white woman kneeled beside her bed, and he gave her a kiss on the forehead and told her he would see her on the other side. And he walked out of the room, and he looked at me, and he said, just remember this, Mr. Ron, there ain't nothing ever ends that something new don't begin. A few hours later, she went to be with the Lord. And 3 days later, he spoke at her funeral. And he shared, after all these years of 25 years on the streets, that Debbie was the first one to love him. Many people had given him a sandwich. Many people had flipped him coins and given him $1. And he'd even beaten a few people out of dollars. But they had all kept him alive, that little bit of money and those few sandwiches. But nobody wanted to know his name. And nobody wanted to know or see his heart. And he shared in front of 1,000 people that it was the Christ and Miss Debbie became the hope of glory for him. He said, you know what? Nothing else but love mattered. It was her love that made him want to change. And he said it was like an old song they used to sing back on the plantation. You've sung it in the Church of Christ church for years. When nothing else could help, love lifted me. And I can tell you it's the Christ in you here tonight that will make a difference in the people that Arms of Hope serves. I can tell you when he got finished speaking, he got a standing ovation from 1,000 people. By noon the next day, he shared her dream for this new mission. And by noon the next day, more than $500,000 came in to begin instruction on that mission. Within 1 year, $5 million, and now, a few years later, $11 million, and the finest homeless mission in all of America now stands in downtown Fort Worth. And the big, beautiful chapel is named after Debbie. On the sidewalk where he used to sleep in front of my gallery, 5 years after that, he stood in the ballroom of the Worthington Hotel, the grand ballroom with 800 of Fort Worth's finest citizens there, where he stood to receive the award as the Philanthropist of the Year for the city of Fort Worth. And I can tell you in November of this year, he will receive the award as the Good Samaritan of the Year for Houston, Texas, on November the 1st in Houston. This is the man that for many years I thought was trash on our streets, and other people in our did too. But he'll tell you that God can turn trash into a treasure. And I want to just close now by reading just a couple of lines from our book to let you know that Debbie's dream really was from God. She never doubted it was, but sometimes I did. From our book. The Sunday after the groundbreaking for the new mission, Denver and I pulled into the parking lot of the new Mount Calvary Baptist Church, a church in a depressed neighborhood in southeast Fort Worth. Pastor Tom Franklin had heard Denver speak at Deborah's memorial service and for months had kept after me to try to convince him to come and preach at his church. And finally, Denver agreed. I had prayed for a standing room only crowd, but by the looks of the parking lot, folks were standing somewhere else that morning. As the service began and the tiny congregation filled the air with old spirituals, Denver and I huddled on the back row. Pastor Tom had wanted me to introduce Denver from the pulpit and spend a few minutes telling his life story, but as I suspected, old Denver wasn't having any of that. So during the singing, he and I huddled on the back row to negotiate what he would let me say. So what do you want me to say? I asked him. And he said, well, it ain't nobody's business how I got here. Besides, I don't want to tell them nothing about me. I just want to tell them about the Lord. Okay. Well, what can I tell them then? He said, he paused and he stared down at the Bible that was laying next to me on the bench. Just tell them I'm a nobody that's trying to tell everybody about somebody that can save anybody. And Mr. Ron, that is all you need to tell them, folks. And so when the singing stopped, I walked down to the front and I said just that. Then Denver took the pulpit. At first his voice quivered a bit, but it was loud, and the longer he preached, the louder and stronger it became, and like a magnet, his voice pulled people off the streets. And by the time he had wiped his face and sat down, the pews were full. And like a cannonball, Pastor Tom shot out of his seat into the pulpit, raising his arms toward the people and said, I believe God wants Denver to come back and preach a revival in our city. The congregation, most of whom had been drawn to the sanctuary by Denver's voice, exploded into applause. And my mind flashed back to Debbie's dream. Her seeing Denver's face and recalling the words of Solomon. There was found in the city a certain poor man who was wise. And by his wisdom, he saved the city. Something new had begun. And it was something I was certain had Debbie dancing for joy on streets of gold. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like for you now to meet and hear him sing a song that will bless your soul. Mr. Denver Moore, the man of Debbie's dreams. Denver, come up and shut him down.
God bless you.
God bless you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I thank God for being here this evening. I thank God for all of you who is trying to make America a better place for those who don't have the opportunity to do something for themselves. And that's one of the wonderfulest things that we could do, is serve one another as God has served us. God has raised me from walking dead man to a living soul. I trust in God for all things. Let's sing. Nothing happened by luck or coincidence. Everything's dotted down in time. That which must befall thee must befall thee. That which must pass thee by must pass thee by. It has been written, the ink is dry, and the pages is torn. Every day carries all miracles. So sometime I just waited for God. And at a point in my life, I wasn't really scared to die. I still ain't. Because I know to live is to suffer and to die is the gain. And I don't believe Jesus was scared to die. Did you hear me? He didn't say, don't y'all kill me. Did you hear me? How in the world are you going to get to heaven unless you die anyway? You understand what I'm saying? So sometimes we get to complain about other people. Listen, let me tell you something. That which must befall thee must befall thee. That means the things that's going to happen to you when the time you come on this earth is going to happen to you. That which passed thee by must pass thee by. That means the things that passed you by that you figured what you could have had wasn't none of yours. Why you want somebody else's stuff? It has been written, the ink is dry and the page is torn. Every day carries its own miracle. Through the years, I cut it short, didn't I? I'm going to get up out of here. I kept on toiling. I was toiling through the storm and rain. I was waiting so patiently to hear my say your voice again. Oh, so he could hide me in his love. Yes, and write my name above. You're now winning when them gates swing open now. Walking in, y'all, I'm tired of the load I'm carrying. I'm so tired of this burden I'm bearing. Lord, now keep me under your protection and keep me humble until the end. Hide me in your love, yes, and write my name above. Yeah, now when them gates swing open now, walking in. Thank you.